Hillary Clinton boldly strode inside the Senate room and labeled Senator John Kennedy a carnival barker to his visage, anticipating a frictionless political massacre. She possessed completely no clue that this rustic Louisiana attorney was preparing to bolt the entrances, mobilize 3 decades of her bleakest controversies, and utilize a humble catfish breeder to openly deconstruct her pristine heritage bit by brutal bit. The day was May 14th, 2025, within the massive wood-paneled boundaries of Meeting Room 216 inside the Hart Senate Office Complex in Washington, D.C. The Senate Judiciary Panel had assembled what seemed like a dreadfully administrative gathering regarding transparency and national document handling. It was a heading so intentionally boring that not a solitary journalist from the Capital Media Group had troubled to submit an early article, a shared indifference that dissolved into a panic the second the guest roster spilled at 7:00 p.m. the previous evening. There was simply one title upon it: Hillary Rodham Clinton, called as the exclusive testifier, staring down Senator John Neely Kennedy, the conservative from Louisiana, as the primary interrogator. The mood within the space was overwhelmingly charged. The palm that had endorsed monumental foreign treaties with 112 independent countries, the palm that had tightly grasped a microphone through 36 exhausting executive and preliminary discussions, the palm that had held the solid leather chair in the crisis center on the evening Osama bin Laden was tracked down in the shadows, that exact palm dropped onto the smooth wooden top of the testimony desk with a solitary, accurate knock. It was the intentional grounding motion of an experienced courtroom attorney placing a file on a magistrate's desk. Hillary Clinton rested completely straight, shielded in a deep indigo outfit. It was not the radiant, optimistic azure of her 2016 campaign path, nor the authoritative, dominant crimson of her United Nations speeches. This was indigo, the subdued, unyielding shade of someone who had previously quit attempting to convince the populace and had shifted entirely into the state of electoral endurance. Fastened to her color was a solitary pearl, exactly sufficient to project a quiet statement of "I still count" without yelling to the ceilings, "I still desire the presidency." The microphone secured ahead of her was active, buzzing with electric tension. The bright glow of the meeting room bulbs illuminated the spotless exterior of her viewing spectacles. The pairs she had only begun donning openly during the harsh wake of the 2016 defeat, as if the massive burden of that loss had ultimately given her the authorization to admit to the globe that her vision, similarly, was declining. The panel had mumbled a couple procedural formalities, and Clinton affirmed the steady, rehearsed affirmation of a lady who had rested in the sights of legislative panels more occasions than most of the politicians on the stage had actually served on one. She understood the exact rhythm of this performance, the specific auditory gap needed from the device to her mouth to convey dominance, and naturally, which C-SPAN broadcasting perspective, positioned high in the balcony, recorded her most devastatingly grave look. Next, the portals opened wide, and Senator John Kennedy strolled inside. He did not march with the frantic pace of Washington. He sank into his padded seat with the slow, purposeful comfort of a Louisiana relative lowering himself onto a weathered timber dock on a weekend afternoon. He acted like a fellow who possessed all the hours in the universe, completely cognizant that the creatures darting below him were not heading anywhere. He sported a seersucker outfit, the material wrinkled at the joint just a bit too heavily, his necktie drooping a half-inch off balance to the left. It was a deliberate appearance, not because he was an untidy guy, but because he grasped that within the rural counties of Louisiana, complete, polished flawlessness renders folks instinctively wary. Clinton fixed her gaze upon him, her mouth squeezed together so firmly they created a pale streak, a look void of a grin or a scowl, a facade she had painstakingly rehearsed and solidified over 3 decades in the public view. It was a stare that broadcasted she was bodily attending, but had absorbed every single syllable of this previously. Before the politician could even part his lips, she initiated her preemptive attack, her tone piercing through the quiet stillness of the meeting space like a jagged blade slicing through heated margarine. "Senator Kennedy," she declared, her voice soaking with practiced superiority, "before you start your Carnival Barker act in that seersucker outfit, I would care to advise you that I have represented this nation as First Lady, a United States Senator, and the Secretary of State. I have rested before 17 distinct legislative panels. I did not travel here today to endure humor." The meeting chamber descended into an utter, gasping silence. Positioned right behind Clinton, her assistant, a youthful lady with a carefully tight updo and a Georgetown MBA, who completely grasped that her exclusive professional obligation in this instance was not to guide, but to visually support bobbed-in quick consensus. Kennedy, however, did not respond, wince, lift a solitary doubting brow, or permit the shadow of a smirk to grace his mouth. He simply reached into the chest pouch of his jacket, withdrew a pair of metal-framed spectacles, and retrieved a spotless cloth. With excruciating sluggishness, he started to wipe the glass in tiny, precise, unbroken loops, acting with the steady endurance of a Cajun angler carefully wiping down a corroded hook before tossing it into cloudy depths. Eventually, he slid the spectacles onto his visage. "Madam Secretary," he commenced, his heavy Louisiana accent flowing out of the audio setup as thick and dense as summer syrup. "I value that, and you are precisely correct. You indeed possess the most extraordinary record of anyone who has ever dropped a presidential contest." He delayed, allowing the quiet linger for 2 counts, exactly sufficient for every single person in that space to comprehend, with a creeping feeling of anxiety, what the subsequent phrase was bound to be. 2 lines behind Kennedy, Senator Mike Lee suddenly slapped his palm over his lips, masking a quick, harsh burst of chuckling as a fierce cough. Kennedy proceeded, his tone completely void of spite, neither elevating in tone nor dropping, uttering the phrases as informally as though he were reciting off a weekend shopping record. "You have served as First Lady, a Senator, Secretary of State, a 2-time presidential nominee. That record holds absolutely everything on it, except the lone position you truly desired." Clinton did not flinch. It was a frightening show of discipline, a physical talent that demands 3 brutal decades in the governmental trenches to hone to absolute perfection, the bizarre capacity to hear a marksman's round scream past your head without blinking, and then to beam as though the blast were a courteous praise. And thus she beamed, the classic governmental grin, her mouth squeezed painfully firm, her gaze entirely empty and void of affection, locking down on the space like a chilly metal elevator gate shutting on somebody you frantically wish to dodge. Kennedy allowed that fabricated grin rest there in the quiet atmosphere, allowing it broadcast in high definition over C-SPAN to 14 million trapped residences. He needed the viewers resting in their parlors to observe the immense hubris of a lady who had entered conflict against Barack Obama and Donald Trump, and who had determined, before Kennedy's audio was even turned on, that this fellow in the inexpensive jacket was fundamentally beneath her intelligence. It was precisely what Kennedy required. The manner an expert angler needs a huge bass to violently bite the lure before he fiercely secures the metal barb. "Madam Secretary, I wish to remain perfectly clear concerning something," Kennedy stated. And in that moment, his tone sank an entire octave into the deep, frightening richness shaped in the grueling seminar halls of Oxford University and the ruthless legal lecture rooms of Vanderbilt. "I am not a Carnival Barker. I am indeed the Rhodes Scholar resting in this space, and you remain the testifier." He did not halt for a defense. That precise adjustment wasn't intended for her vanity. It was carefully designed for the 38 million individuals who would eventually view the popular snippet, debating whether the fellow in the seersucker jacket was the jester she asserted he was, or the Terminator he was preparing to reveal himself to be. Without interrupting eye contact, Kennedy dug into his satchel and extracted a typical hardback volume with a distinct azure spine and thick ivory writing. What happened? It was the lengthy, highly guarded autobiography Clinton had authored in the sour aftermath of her crushing 2016 electoral ruin. He placed it upon the desk softly, pushing it against the timber like a litigator entering a homicide instrument into the formal evidentiary file. Madam Secretary, I reviewed your publication. Indeed, I reviewed it twice. The initial instance out of sheer intrigue, the subsequent instance because I honestly did not trust what I viewed the initial time. He commenced to flip the sheets, which he had carefully marked with vibrantly tinted gold, azure, and crimson adhesive markers, appearing exactly like a frantic legal pupil studying for a ruthless ultimate test. Only this test wasn't to challenge him. It was an examination intended to fracture her. Page 12. You faulted James Comey, he declared, turning a leaf. Page 24. You faulted Russia. Turn. Page 41. Misogyny. Turn. Page 58. Bernie Sanders, who resided in your own faction, incidentally. Turn. Page 79. The traditional press. Page 95. WikiLeaks. Page 113. Countryside citizens. The precise individuals you notoriously dubbed deplorable. He ceased turning the sheets and glanced up, his stare drilling into her. I tallied 24 separate causes in this text, Madam Secretary. 24 frantic causes why you dropped the 2016 contest. He stretched up, detached his spectacles, and started to wipe them once more. The audience was starting to understand, noticing that this systematic wiping was his frightening tempo, the intentional pacing of a master musician plucking at the chords directly prior to starting into a fiery performance. 24 causes, and not alone isolated. One of them stated, I simply failed to tour in Wisconsin. A surge of gentle, unintentional chuckling echoed across the filled public seating, the strained, suppressed chuckling that escapes via a human's nostrils when somebody finally possesses the utter bravery to state the precise detail everybody in the space has pondered for a decade but was too scared to speak out loud. Kennedy bent closer, leaning his arms upon the podium. My close pal Boudreaux, he resides down over in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. Well, Boudreaux lost a regional angling competition previous year, and he lost terribly. He finished absolutely last. Among 47 experienced anglers, Boudreaux succeeded to snare the least catfish. He fixed his gaze upon Clinton, who stayed completely still, a sculpture fashioned out of governmental stone. Now, Boudreaux, he authored a catalog of justifications as well. He stated the current was moving poorly. He stated the creatures merely were not famished that afternoon. He asserted the daylight was blinding right into his vision. He stated the vessel swayed at the incorrect moment. He promised his barb was twisted out of form. He even faulted the nearby canine for howling too heavily. He held 24 causes. Kennedy delayed, and the shared inhale of the whole meeting chamber halted with him, hanging in the intolerable strain. Yet not one of his 24 causes stated, my lure was terrible. Kennedy released the thick volume down onto the desk with a heavy thump. Do you realize what the completely most tragic piece of this entails, Madam Secretary? Throughout all 400 lengthy sheets of that text, and I studied it thoroughly, since we Louisiana people perform completely everything slowly except consume our stew, you allocated exactly one section to the territory of Wisconsin. Merely one. He knocked the binding, and that lone section does not hold the phrases, I committed an error and never placed foot within Wisconsin. No. That section boastfully proclaims that your internal numbers indicated Wisconsin remained a secure wager. Numbers. He angled his skull, his visage a facade of pretend perplexity. Well, Boudreaux held numbers too. Boudreaux's numbers indicated that Catfish completely adored prawn lure during the period of May. But previous year, the Catfish determined they did not desire prawn lure during May, and thus Boudreaux lost the competition. Yet Boudreaux didn't travel indoors and draft a 400-page declaration faulting the blasted prawn. The quiet that trailed was overwhelming. Boudreaux merely shifted to crawler lure, Kennedy murmured. He glanced downward at the azure spine of the text, and subsequently steadily lifted his gaze back up to Clinton's visage. And within that brief, split second, a blink so incredibly rapid that merely the magnified lens of C-SPAN Device 2 succeeded to record it, his gaze was cleared of all ridicule. There existed no victorious sparkle of a partisan combatant scoring a strike. His gaze was intensely, profoundly mournful. It was the chilling appearance of authentic grief a fellow acquires when he observes a human dig their own tomb for 3 decades and understands they are still fiercely clutching the spade. I do not loathe you, Madam Secretary, he stated, his tone lowering into a gentler, nearly personal pitch. Currently, I merely sense pity for you. Since you have invested 40 exhausting years faulting everyone else upon the surface of the globe, and the lone individual you have never, ever faulted is the exact individual glaring back at you within the glass. The lone individual genuinely accountable. Kennedy stretched out and knocked the hardback of the autobiography with his pointing digit. The most pristine meaning of utter privilege, Madam Secretary, involves dropping a monumental contest and subsequently capitalizing off a 400-page text detailing why the remainder of the cosmos is at fault. He knocked the binding a second instance, firmer. Boudreaux lost as well. Yet Boudreaux didn't author a text. Boudreaux stared into the glass, and Boudreaux swapped his lure. The fabricated governmental grin fixed across Clinton's visage bodily shrank, not completely disappearing, but pulling tight like a musical cord that had merely been twisted, a lethal half-rotation too much. Her lids stayed immobile, declining to blink, yet below the lip of the desk, out of view of the lenses, her right palm dragged half an inch over the polished timber, her digits frantically hunting for something sturdy to grip onto. There existed absolutely nothing remaining to grip. Detecting the crack, Kennedy informally withdrew a paper-thin paper folder holding roughly 20 sheets at maximum. It was not the sort of massive, swollen file that showboating politicians normally throw upon their tables to amaze the prime-time broadcast lenses. Kennedy's folder was slender because he was acting like an expert angler who approaches the brink of the lake holding precisely 3 particular baits, since he already realizes precisely what beasts are hiding in the deep liquid. Madam Secretary, let us converse regarding your correspondence. A tired breath slipped Clinton's mouth, unbelievably quiet, but the highly precise targeted microphone captured the flow of oxygen. It was the sigh of a lady assaulted by this precise inquiry 4,717 occasions. Each instance that term pierced the broadcasts, her shoulders automatically lifted precisely 1 fraction, nearly 5 continuous yards of protective bracing, deep enough to suffocate a human in the torturous recollection of 33,000 erased documents. Kennedy pushed ahead, his southern sweet tone presently tinged with a jagged, metallic sharpness. A personal, unprotected network, resting in the damp cellar of your private residence in Chappaqua, not sheltered in a secure, reinforced federal building, not operating on a protected federal framework. In your cellar, hidden somewhere, right alongside the warm liquid boiler and the dusty crates of December ornaments, if the building layouts are to be trusted. He allowed that horrific picture strike with heavy force, the Secretary of State directing supremely guarded international messages across a weak piece of equipment that occupied cellar floor area alongside synthetic festive garlands. The informal, staggering carelessness was the ruin. And next, there involved bleach bit. Kennedy proceeded his pitch evening out into a chilly, detached hum. Combat-grade information wiping program intentionally applied to cleanse that network completely empty. You failed to merely press the erase button. You utilized bleach bit. That is the extremely specific program that folks merely utilize when they do not desire the FBI, the NSA, or the Almighty himself to ever review what was hidden upon that storage unit. Kennedy delayed, glaring right into Clinton's gaze, allowing the phantom of her personal arrogance occupy the quiet chamber. She spoke completely nothing, and when somebody questioned you regarding it, you responded, "What? Like using a rag?" Kennedy recited the notorious statement aloud, his tone presently as even chilly and lifeless as a frozen pond at the break of morning. He set his palm even upon the desk. "That statement, Madam Secretary, will shadow you right into your tomb." And honestly, it must. The stifling quiet that engulfed the chamber was the epiphany of hundreds of individuals concurrently reviewing that haughty audio clip in their heads, abruptly comprehending that the casualness of it still scorched the national soul. My close pal Boudreaux Kennedy pondered quietly, if Boudreaux intentionally erased 33,000 mobile dispatches off his personal mobile device and subsequently stared his spouse Marie right in the gaze and smirked, "What, like using a rag?" Well, Marie would leave him prior to the daylight dropping. He angled his skull, assuming a chatty pitch that hid a fatal dose of meaning. Marie relies on Boudreaux regarding her holy household catfish formulas, which represents the completely ultimate kind of unbreakable reliance within Cajun society. Yet 33,000 erased dispatches? Even a holy person like Marie possesses her absolute boundaries. The sharp, rough chuckling of severe agony burst within the chamber, the uncontrollable noise that violently slips a human's windpipe when compelled to face a chilling reality they never wished to acknowledge. Kennedy harshly turned to the subsequent leaf of his slender file. Past FBI Chief James Comey openly declared that your management of supremely guarded, classified data was supremely reckless. 110 separate dispatches holding supremely guarded data upon an unprotected network. 8 correspondence threads at the top secret SAP tier, the completely supreme guarding tier within the United States administration. He flipped a different leaf, the document rustling noisily in the strained atmosphere. And presently, Madam Secretary, rests the newly opened section. Senator Chuck Grassley merely uncovered that the FBI never actually completed checking all the seized storage sticks that held the duplicate versions of your correspondence. Never. In 2025, there remain physical storage sticks locked within an investigation room that have never once been unsealed. Kennedy steadily turned his skull, glaring right down the chamber of the illuminated C-SPAN recording lens, talking straight to the millions of citizens observing upon shattered screen devices and muggy phishing peers. Vice President Vance questioned you a highly direct query at a previous session. He requested you to clarify the basic distinction between a junior corporal in the military who misuses guarded data and a politically linked Secretary of State who commits the exact identical action. The junior corporal is hauled away in shackles and enters federal penitentiary. The Secretary of State authors an autobiography. Kennedy knocked his pointing digit upon the wood table, a continuous pounding. I would highly appreciate to listen to the truthful reply to that query as well, Madam Secretary. For the primary instance since the session started, Clinton's stiff pose fractured. She steadily lifted her right palm and carefully fixed the edges of her spectacles, not because they were slanted, but because her form frantically required a physical diversion, so her racing mind could purchase 3 vital seconds to create a retaliation. Yet 3 seconds facing John Kennedy was nowhere near sufficient. Madam Secretary, Kennedy drawled, his tone slowing down into the chilling, purposeful concentration of an emergency physician firmly holding a blade over an uncovered vessel. Let us converse regarding Mr. Christopher Steele. Clinton did not wince, yet her assistant, the Georgetown MBA, immediately panicked, her left palm fiercely gliding toward the paper stack, her digit frantically bending a heavily censored leaf. Occasionally, the most frantic act of courtroom protection involves frantically attempting to turn the correct leaf of a collapsing barrier. The Steele file, Kennedy declared with the informal disconnect of a fellow reciting a restaurant card. Your political operation expressly compensated the elite legal group of Perkins Coie. Perkins Coie channeled those funds to Fusion GPS. Fusion GPS compensated Christopher Steele, a past ruined English spy agent. Mr. Steele authored a supremely scandalous paper grounded exclusively on unnamed Russian informants, the exact identical Russia that you vocally asserted meddled in our holy ballots, and that unconfirmed paper somehow mysteriously discovered its path straight into the grasp of the FBI. Kennedy lifted his palm into the atmosphere, his digits spread apart, and aggressively tallied down the link of transfer. You compensated Perkins Coie, 1 digit. Perkins Coie compensated Fusion GPS. 2 digits. Fusion GPS compensated Steele. 3. Steele utilized shady Russian informants. 4. The FBI purposefully utilized that corrupted paper to illegitimately secure a highly invasive monitoring order. 5. He dropped his palm and bent in dangerously near to the audio receiver. 5 separate phases. 5 dense tiers of costly legal shielding. Exactly enough crafted separation for you to claim I remained unaware at each phase. Yet massive quantities of funds, Madam Secretary, constantly discover the path straight home. He turned a different leaf. The FBI spitefully utilized that fabricated paper to secure FISA orders aiming at an American resident. The reviewing official discovered 17 massive mistakes within those order requests. 17 disastrous breaches of individual freedoms. An FBI legal representative called Kevin Kleinsmith actually confessed culpability to intentionally forging material proof within that request, and he entered federal penitentiary. Kennedy delayed, allowing the criminal sentence linger. 17 mistakes. I questioned 12 final year legal pupils at LSU, not Harvard, not Yale, but rugged LSU legal pupils. How many massive mistakes within a classified FISA request represents reckless conduct, and how many represents a calculated, unlawful plot? All 12 provided me the exact identical reply. 1 mistake is reckless. 2 mistakes is highly questionable. 17 mistakes is a heavily backed, planned mission. For the tertiary instance, Kennedy steadily dragged the spectacles off his visage, the room understanding the subsequent phrase would be a devastating blow that no governmental twisting could weather. You intentionally backed a fabricated paper that became the exclusive foundation for unlawfully monitoring an American resident. That paper was entirely invalidated. The classified orders were disastrously defective. The national attorney entered penitentiary, and investigating counsel John Durham verified, under testimony, that your presidential operation remained the central backing origin. He dropped his spectacles upon the timber with the heavy conclusion of a meat cutter slamming a cleaned fish downward onto a stained chopping block. And next, with all of that revealed, you appeared on a famous audio show in 2019 and possessed the audacity to openly label Tulsi Gabbard, an honored military veteran, a ranked state militia leader, a lady who completed 2 harsh tours in a live combat theater, a Russian operative. Kennedy bent fiercely forward above the podium. It remains the exact identical strategy. Trump, Russian operative. Tulsi, Russian operative. Jill Stein, Russian operative. Anyone who ventured to differ with you ideologically, Russian operative. He glanced downward at his palms, then upward. Chief of National Security Gabbard merely unsealed Senator Adam Schiff's guarded intelligence file on broadcast television previous week, and the monetary tract leads straight back to your operation. The exact identical web. The exact identical shady attorneys. The exact identical backing origins. Kennedy allowed that terrible network of links inhale within the quiet chamber. Schiff, Steele, Clinton, Gabbard, Perkins Coie, the identical poisonous string trembling across Washington until Gabbard fiercely pulled it to the top, uncovering not a creature, but a dense, corroded tether. He leaned backward with a profoundly mournful, somber grin. Within Louisiana, Madam Secretary, when the lure ceases functioning, we swap the lure. Yet you merely continued fiercely utilizing the exact identical lure upon everyone who defeated you at some stage when literally everyone you disdain is mysteriously a Russian operative. Perhaps the underlying issue isn't actually Russia. Clinton bent sharply to her left, a frantic, unintentional lean toward her assistant, the pure reflex of a besieged official seeking her attorney when the proof becomes lethally toxic. Yet the youthful assistant declined to glance upward, gaze fixed downward in absolute panic, frantically ripping across sheets for a mystical defense that did not exist upon any sheet of paper. The barrier was destroyed. Kennedy withdrew a somewhat blurry Google Earth image, the brilliance of his tactic leaning on simple proof that anybody at home could immediately check. Haiti, he declared, allowing the syllables linger like dense soot from a rubber blaze. Following the catastrophic 2010 tremor, the Global Alliance promised an astounding $4.4 billion to reconstruct Haiti. The Clinton charity assumed a primary, dominant part in the allocation. Your personal spouse served as the UN chief representative. You were serving as the Secretary of State, possessing the ultimate authority to authorize federal relief payouts. And astonishingly, the Clinton charity acquired millions in massive contributions from the exact identical builders frantically pursuing those profitable rebuilding deals. He placed the picture downward, $4.4 billion. Do you possess any clue exactly how many lasting residences were finally constructed using those funds, Madam Secretary? The quiet was utter. 6? He allowed the pitiful figure break across the chamber. 6 residences. My pal Boudreaux resolved to create a business catfish pool. It ran him precisely $4,000 out of pocket. It demanded 6 months of tough work and yielded a harvest of 200 plump catfish. Kennedy angled his skull, his gaze expanding with a pretend naivete void of ridicule. Boudreaux mysteriously possesses a hugely better gain on investment compared to the entire international structure of the Clinton charity, Madam Secretary, and Boudreaux fails to even hire a workforce of 2,000, neither does he possess a past commander sitting as his joint head. The complete lack of his rustic grin rendered the harsh calculations chilling. The huge Caracol manufacturing zone was promoted to generate 60,000 lucrative roles. It genuinely generated hardly a couple thousand, mainly exhausting factory work compensating lowest wage. And the Royal Oasis Lodge, a massive upscale resort constructed utilizing global relief funds right in the center of a ruined nation where scarred individuals were resting in filthy dirt shelters. He glanced downward in revulsion. You led an upscale lodge where human souls resided in shelter settlements. That represents not global philanthropy. Down south, we term that extracting cruel profit from the defenseless. He turned a leaf, his tone lowering into a dark pitch. The FOB network. Pal of Bill, the WJC VIP tag. William Jefferson Clinton, very important person. Recorded inner sorting symbols inside the Clinton charity's personal correspondence. Business builders were expedited not due to their structural ability or rival pricing, but strictly due to their close monetary tie to the past commander. Kennedy set his palm even across the papers, and presently, DOGE, the freshly created agency of federal effectiveness, is formally initiating a broad investigative review into every single deal, payout, and concealed FOB dispatch. He glared straight at Clinton, $4,000 and 200 catfish, or $4.4 billion and 6 pitiful residences. I remain no complex calculator, but I recognize when the figures upon the record do not tally up. He flipped one last leaf, uncovering a chilling, blurry picture showing a boundless, tortuous line of ragged azure canvas shelters spanning to the dismal skyline in Port-au-Prince. 2014, 4 whole years after $4.4 billion allegedly showered downward. Do you realize exactly what the agonizing Haitian populace name your highly praised relief network, Madam Secretary? Kennedy inquired, his tone bearing an even, frightening, detached chilliness. Within their local tongue, it converts straight to theft wearing fine garments. He laid the picture front downward upon the desk like a doomed item. Down within the marshlands of Louisiana, we hold an ancient proverb. No one is more destitute than a destitute fellow who is being aided by a wealthy fellow who frantically desires to become famous. Boudreaux stated that. And Boudreaux cannot even locate Haiti upon a chart. Clinton's palm shook barely as she gripped her liquid tumbler, consuming an excruciatingly drawn-out, careful gulp. She did not swallow because her throat remained dry. She swallowed because the harsh truth of governmental performance mandates that a currently gulping mouth cannot be compelled to reply a devastating query. The liquid tumbler drained to the middle line, yet her palms stayed locked firmly around it, her joints shifting pale, broadcasting a quiet admission of culpability under the harsh shine of the beam. Next, Kennedy rigidly aligned his stance within the huge padded seat, and the atmospheric change was so immense that every individual within the space immediately observed. During the prior 20 minutes, he had expertly acted the rustic Louisiana attorney, concealing a razor-keen barb within a glob of sugary nectar lure. But currently, the grin disappeared, the thick drawl dissolved, and Boudreaux was missing. Within that seat rested merely a toughened fellow who grasped the holy significance of the term duty. I have remained resting here, delivering rustic humor during the prior 20 minutes, Kennedy declared. His tone cleared of all warmth, pristine and chilly as a fellow reciting titles off a granite marker. Yet I am completely not going to deliver a lone joke right here. Since 4 Americans perished in the soil, and you rested facing this Republican boldly inquired, what impact does it render? The whole meeting space immediately froze, the oxygen becoming freezing. Envoy Chris Stevens, Data Director Sean Smith, 2 highly skilled CIA protection agents, Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty. Kennedy recited the holy titles with agonizing sluggishness via memory. 600 separate, frantic protection appeals were desperately transmitted to your diplomatic department in the agonizing months preceding that fatal assault. 600, not 6, not 60, 600 shouts for rescue. He delayed, allowing the massive numerical breakdown settle in. 13 agonizing hours passed from the second the brutal assault penetrated the facility to the second the shooting stopped. Tyrone Woods was placed upon that flaming roof, actively marking hostile marks with a light pointer, frantically begging for flying backup that never arrived. He allowed that crushing phrase rest heavily within the silent atmosphere. Within combat missions, a fighter pointing a light pointer into the pitch-dark heavens signifies merely a single reality. That fellow completely trusts his republic is arriving to rescue him. Tyrone Woods aimed that beam into the dark heavens for hours, gripping onto that belief, and the heavens stayed completely vacant. 13 hours, Kennedy echoed, the phrases hitting like dense steel smashes. A frantic fellow can perform a whole lot of perishing within 13 hours. Marking a mark for 13 continuous hours demands a deep, holy sort of belief that you simply fail to acquire at Yale Legal Academy or the diplomatic department. You acquire it within the United States military. Kennedy's tone did not falsely swallow back a weep. The utter lack of dramatic sentiment rendered it endlessly more chilling. Boudreaux fails to grasp a single thing concerning Benghazi. Yet Boudreaux grasps that whenever a brother American yells for rescue, you depart. You fail to assemble a panel to ponder what impact it renders. You depart. That represents not a governmental creed, Madam Secretary. That represents a basic mortal one. He glanced downward at his motionless palms, laying even like a fellow bowing in worship. Tyrone Woods abandoned behind 2 parentless kids. Sean Smith abandoned behind 3. Envoy Chris Stevens was slaughtered prior to he ever received the opportunity to begin a household. Glenn Doherty held a little girl whom he dialed over a staticky visual link every evening from Libya. Kennedy discussed them as comrades in conflict. And you rested cozily facing a legislative panel, stared the mourning relatives within the gaze via the lens, and required to learn what impact, at this stage, does it render. Clinton bodily cracked, turning her gaze away from Kennedy, away from the C-SPAN lens, glaring emptily toward the blank drywall. It was the precise, tortured action past testifiers utilized when compelled to listen to the holy titles of the deceased recited aloud, dragged by a pulling gravity toward the shadowy recess where merely the profoundly culpable ventured to stare. Kennedy shoved his seat backward and stood to his complete towering stature, his giant profile completely occupying the vacant area and projecting a stretched, shadowy outline straight upon Clinton. He detached his spectacles for the ultimate instance, gripping the wire edges firmly. First Lady, Senator, Secretary of State, 2-time presidential nominee. He repeated the shining record as a harsh, unpolished tribute for an endless drive. The most extraordinary record of anyone who has ever dropped the presidency twofold. 33,000 completely destroyed dispatches, $4.4 billion wasted for 6 pitiful residences, 4 valiant Americans abandoned to perish in the soil. And what impact does it render? A fabricated Russian file that straightly sparked the most disastrous monitoring controversy in the past of the FBI. An audio show where you casually smeared a combat veteran as a Russian operative. And a 400-page text where you fiercely faulted 24 distinct individuals for your personal collapse, and not a lone one remained you. He bent forward and placed his spectacles upon the table with startling delicacy, like setting a bloom atop a new tomb. Would you wish to reply? Silence ticked by. Hillary Clinton parted her lips. Every survival instinct forged over 30 years of warfare rushed forward. Her spine stiffened, chin rose, and vocal cords found that unyielding baritone. Senator, the unparalleled threats to our very republic. Kennedy raised his hand like a patrolman halting traffic. I did not ask you about the republic, he murmured, unbelievably quiet. I asked you about the bait. Clinton froze, trapped in the humiliating purgatory between speech and silence. This was the fatal moment her legendary pivot died. She was powerless to deflect because Kennedy had entirely consumed the room's oxygen, weaving a devastatingly tight narrative where she was permanently downgraded to a supporting character. Madam Secretary, you compulsively faulted others for your failures for 30 years, Kennedy repeated. Private servers were traps. The 2016 election was Russia's blame. Benghazi was a witch hunt. Haiti was misinformation. Tulsi Gabbard was a Russian operative. Kennedy glared down, holding authentic, crushing sympathy, the torturous pity of watching a creature hopelessly snared within a trap it built and walked into daily for 3 decades. Boudreaux lost a fishing tournament once, Kennedy stated, dead last. Among 47 anglers, Boudreaux caught the fewest catfish. Do you wish to know what Boudreaux uttered when he walked through his gate? The entire chamber held its breath. My bait was bad, Kennedy whispered. That is it. He did not blame Russia. He did not author a manifesto weeping about it. He merely swapped his bait, went out, and won the tournament the next year. Kennedy slipped his spectacles onto his face. You never swapped your bait, Madam Secretary. Across 30 years, you never once held the modesty to observe the crushing outcomes and declare, "My bait was bad, and that is why I keep losing." Clinton's mouth parted, snapped, closed, and parted again like a suffocating fish hauled onto a muddy bank seeking a lifeline. High in the gallery, a staffer pressed her hand against her chest, bearing witness to a mortal tragedy. For the first time in 40 years, Clinton's magic trick collapsed. 10 seconds of quiet passed. "Swap the bait, Madam Secretary. It is not too late," Kennedy murmured. He abruptly stepped away and strolled out without a backward glance, grasping that expert anglers never waste time waiting for a bite when the pond is empty. The gallery shattered the silence with applause mixed with quiet laughter. Clinton remained frozen while her panicked assistant turned blank folders. What happened stayed open, 24 excuses aiming toward the ceiling. The tremors were instantaneous and disastrous. Viral clips exploded before Kennedy even exited the corridor. A vendor peddled shirts stating, "Boudreaux holds better ROI than the Clinton Foundation." The most circulated snippet remained the lethal command, "Swap the bait." The DOJ probe restarted, ordering the FBI to catalog unreviewed hardware within 30 days. Elon Musk launched a post, $4.4 billion, 6 houses, review the logs, her fees plummeted to zero. Distant from Washington, Hank Thibodeau rested upon his timber pier in Breaux Bridge. During 1997, Hank endured a devastating tournament loss because he obstinately utilized classic river shrimp. Returning in humiliation, he admitted to his spouse, "My bait was bad." The next year, he swapped to redworms and placed third. "Marie!" Hank shouted at his phone. "He narrated my story!" Hank pulled his empty line. "I genuinely swapped my bait." She is still utilizing the identical lifeless worm. Miles away, Teresa Morales washed platters in Little Rock. Kennedy's tone sliced through. "You've remained faulting other folks," Teresa agreed. When her child endured a sporting loss, Teresa provided a crushing lesson. Do not fault the official. Adjust your stroke. Her child adjusted and secured a medical grant. "Your bait is terrible," Teresa murmured. She haughtily labeled him a carnival barker. He questioned concerning the rag. 24 frantic justifications, 33,000 destroyed dispatches, 4 valiant Americans deceased. 40 years of governance collapsed because a lone angler uttered the phrase she failed to, "It was my fault." As the mallet smashed across the Capitol, a chilling truth emerged. A ruthless reckoning had been triggered. The Washington ruling class rested paralyzed in absolute panic, questioning whom Senator John Kennedy would pull into the spotlights next.